Well, good morning. Thanks for joining me on a nice early Friday morning here. My name is Michele Cretser. I'm a IO psychology doctoral student. Um, so my chair, Dr. Rich Thompson, and we'll just go ahead and get started. So this is a proposal for a cross-national meta-analysis, the generalizability of self-determination theory. So next slide, please. Okay, so we'll just jump right in. So the problem statement. So in general, the problem seems that most job attitude theory or models have been developed in North America, most especially in the US, but they're often applied cross-nationally. So of course, this in itself isn't a problem if the theories are applied to similar populations as the study samples. When it becomes a problem is if the verification to generalize is lacking, yet the theory is still applied across countries anyway. So this is a problem for IO psychologists or organizational leaders who rely on science-based job strategies to improve the workplace. So just as problematic, it seems as a field, IO psychology, we haven't found a good or a consistent way to assess the generalizability of job attitude theories cross-nationally. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the study then is to evaluate a model that might be useful for assessing why job attitude theories generalize or do not generalize across countries. So this model is designed by an IO psychologist, Dr. Marcus Creed, and it aims to assess why job attitude theories might or might not generalize cross-nationally. So in other words, what we'd be looking at is how do national differences impact the ability of a particular job attitude theory to generalize. So to evaluate Creed's model, I chose self-determination theory. It's a really popular motivation, a theory for motivation across all sorts of contexts, but most especially in the workplace. So, and it's one of those job attitude theories that's applied cross-nationally, it seems without sufficient support in the ability to do so. So just remember, though, truly what the proposal and the dissertation is about is to evaluate Creed's model. Self-determination theory is just the way to do that. So with that being said, we should go over some of the assumptions of Creed's model and then kind of explain what it is. So to begin, Creed assumes that job attitude theories are most often developed in North America and especially in the US. So a second assumption, most job attitude studies are based on single country data. So these studies might help to establish the generalizability within that country, but of course they'd be lacking when we want to generalize from one country to the next. So to generalize cross-nationally, Creed believes is we need to look at many nations, and we also need to look at multiple nations, national differences, variables jointly. And then the third assumption Creed makes is countries differ on more than just a single variable. It seems pretty obvious, but oftentimes the job attitude research looks at national differences this way with just one country or one single variable. So for example, Hofstede, his cultural dimensions, especially individualism versus collectivism, it's often the sole national differences variable used in a study. But as we all know, nations vary on to more than the degree of individualism or collectivism that they might value. So Creed kind of goes on to give some ideas. I mean, we all have ideas of how countries can differ. But some of his ideas are things like education, the country's education or training system, their health and wellness systems, the environment, climate, values, the structure of the economy, political systems, those types of things. And of course, culture is part of that. So those are the assumptions that support Creed's model. The model itself investigates the role of national differences with a quantitative review of the literature and meta-analysis. So to do this requires collecting job attitude statistics from primary sources grouped by country. So I'll be collecting effect sizes for this. The national differences variables are then selected and imported. And then the final step is to regress the mean observed effect sizes for each country onto the national differences variables. So it sounds pretty simple. So that's Creed's model. And again, that'll serve as a theoretical foundation for my study. Self-determination theory is the job attitude theory I'll evaluate. And I chose this theory not just because I love the theory, but there also appears to have been sufficient information in the literature for a meta-analysis. The initial review also revealed a bit of debate on the assumed universal qualities of self-determination theory. So that being said, we'll go into a little bit of detail of self-determination theory, more so to understand how, or to get to think about, I'd say, how this could be applied from one country to the next, or maybe not. So Deci and Ryan first developed self-determination theory in the 80s, but they and others have continued to detail the theory up until present day. So it started out as a pretty complex theory. They kind of introduced it in a 750-page book, and it hasn't gotten any easier since then. I feel like it's becoming even more complex as time goes on. So we'll go over some general ideas of the theory, but know that this is a very general description. So first, again, some of the assumptions of self-determination theory. It's based on what's called an organismic perspective. And this assumes that organisms, of course, in this case, humans, are inherently active and predisposed towards psychological growth and integration. So in Deci and Ryan's view, and this is a quote, this leads to a tendency for learning, mastery, and connection with others. So this is important to note for a couple of different reasons, but most especially for my study, this perspective begins to explain self-determination's view that all humans have specific, innate, or universal needs, and that's regardless of the environment or context. So in this way, self-determination theory says that personality, work environment, culture, values, those types of things won't impact these needs. So you can see this perspective gives self-determination theory its universal quality, sort of at the foundational level. So we'll come back to the idea of innate needs in a minute, but first we'll go over some ideas on motivation. So in self-determination theory, motivation is viewed as a type rather than the strength. And the type of motivation is looked at on a continuum. So it goes from autonomous motivation to controlled motivation. Well, really, they look at it from control to autonomous, but I like to look at the positive first. So autonomous motivation is also called intrinsic motivation. You might have heard that term more often. It's characterized by an expression of self. It's a volition. The behavior is caused from within the person. So this is basically doing an activity for the sake of doing it. It's something that's enjoyable. And this is the type of motivation, of course, we like to see in the work environment. So outcomes, so far spelled out in the theory anyways, outcomes of intrinsic motivation are well-being, and functional outcomes, which means performance, creativity, those types of things. So on the other end of the spectrum is controlled motivation. These are all the different types of eccentric or extrinsic motivation that we can think of, and it's more than just the converse of intrinsic motivation. So really it covers all those behaviors that are performed for a separable outcome. So these are for incentives, rewards, avoidance of punishment or guilt, values come into play as well. And then extrinsic motivation is broken down a little further into a continuum as well. So this is the continuum of internalization from the least internalized, which is the most controlled types of behaviors. And these are performed solely for a reward or to avoid punishment. And then it moves up the continuum to the most fully internalized. And this is when an individual identifies with or values an extrinsically motivated behavior. So this is when you do something that's not particularly enjoyable, but you do it because you value it. It aligns with those things that you think are important. So Ryan gives an example of collecting money for a nonprofit that you believe in. So asking people for money is not a lot of fun, but you do it because you believe in and you value the nonprofit. So in that way, it's an autonomous sort of motivation. So The greater the level of internalization, excuse me, studies have found that the more positive the outcomes become. So a practical application of self-determination theory in the workplace, for the most positive outcomes, again, those are employee well-being, say, and performance. We want to enhance intrinsic motivation. So how do we do that? The theory suggests that by satisfying basic psychological needs, we can help to enhance intrinsic motivation or the most autonomous forms of extrinsic motivation. And this is it's a sub-theory of self-determination theory. There's 6 of them. We'll only go into this one today. So basic psychological needs, again, these are the innate nutrients based on the organismic perspective that all human beings need for optimal life. So according to the theory, these are the needs for autonomy, for competence, and for relatedness. So you probably recognize that we're revisiting that point in the assumptions that human beings are predisposed to learning, mastery, and connection with others. So really quick, autonomy is different from independence. Oftentimes they're interchanged. They're 2 separate constructs. So autonomy is acting with a sense of choice and volition, and it's a sense of being self-determined. So you can do an autonomous act. It's still considered autonomous. If, say, your manager asks you to do something and you've chosen to do this, it's something you would like to do, that's considered autonomy. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that you do your own thing all the time. You can still do things that others ask you to do, and it's an autonomous form of motivation, and it's autonomy, or your needs are being met that way. Competence is basically a mastery over your environment, and then relatedness, of course, is viewed as a meaningful connection with others. Again, these are the innate needs that every human being needs to experience, and these are the 3 needs that I'll be looking at in primary studies for the meta-analysis. So briefly, to connect motivation and basic psychological needs, an autonomy supportive environment, they're thought to support need satisfactions, which of course enhances the autonomous types of motivation we're looking for. Controlling environments, on the other hand, frustrate or thwart needs, and this results in controlled forms of motivation, and then the related negative outcomes. So looking back at the slide, the research questions, we've kind of talked around them. You can go ahead and take a peek at those. The significance of the study. So Cree believes that there's a missing element or a gap in the field of IO psychology. And this element is a unified theory of how national differences impact job attitude theory. So he believes his model is a step towards the right direction, yet the model hasn't been evaluated yet. So the significance for my part of the study is that's what I'm doing, is I'm aiming to evaluate Creed's theory, hopefully getting us a step closer to a unified theory. Next slide, please. Okay, so the relevant scholarship. So basically, this is a general overview of the research that supports the feasibility and the value of my study. So this is the background information that kind of led me to develop the quantitative review framework. So what I tried to do in this slide was kind of identify the basic categories of supporting literature. So this is single country research, identifying debate in the literature, sufficient information for meta-analysis, and country-specific variables. And we'll go briefly over those as well. So single country research, first of all, there's a lot of single country or 2 country comparisons on self-determination theory. There's far fewer studies that focus on work-related outcomes, but there's still plenty of them out there. So within my initial review of single country data in the work context, was to kind of look at the variables that were identified. And this was helping me, I thought, to put together my framework. So what measures are being used, how they're operationalized, do these studies that will eventually, hopefully, be primary studies, do they, the way they describe their variables, do they align with the theory itself? How am I going to categorize those? What statistics are being reported? So in general, how does this literature align with my research questions, or the other way around? How do my research questions align with the available literature? And in identifying debate, there is debate in the literature on the universality of self-determination theory, whether it's the strengths of the relationships, if there's a relationship, or clearly there, or if there is or if there isn't, I suppose. Sufficient information. In reviewing my current literature review, let's just say there are sufficient numbers of meta-analysis. I don't have an exact number now. I'm currently reviewing about 134 articles for potential inclusion. And I would venture to guess probably over half of those will be included. So that's plenty sufficient to do work with a meta-analysis and systematic review. To date, I've got 14 countries represented. So again, I feel like there's plenty of information out there. And then the country-specific variables, this part has been really difficult. So I'm finding that much of the traditional literature looks at cultural differences rather than national differences. And as we talked about alluded to a little bit, there's a difference between the two. So selecting the national differences variable, it needs to make sense when I'm thinking about self-determination theory, of course. So I'll be looking, or am looking at work-related variables, or different variables that might impact work, but it's got to go beyond the culture variables or Hofstede's, or sometimes even the globe theory, globe project. So to collect these variables, the topics that I'm looking at anyways are things like national economy, per capita income level of industrialization in the company, job types, maybe technology. So all those types of things, work-related aspects that can be seen at a country level. Where to find this information has been challenging. So CREED gives a few suggestions. The World Bank, like I said, the Globe Project for cultural dimensions, international monetary funds, those types of things. But right now that part is a work in progress. So next slide, please. Okay, so the procedures, so I didn't put the first steps on the slide. Basically deciding on an inclusion criteria and developing a search strategy. So my inclusion criteria, the study samples must be working adults. It must also provide measures of variables that align with self-determination theory. Again, the autonomy, relatedness, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, those types of things. Dissertations, theses, and technical reports will be considered. This will help to reduce publication bias. And then based on CREED's recommendation, I've set a limit, publication date limit to 5 years, from 5 years old, 5 years ago. And the reason for this, CREED's example of comparing job attitude data from US samples of 40 years ago, say, with modern day China, with data from, just doesn't make much sense. The world has changed in the last 40 years and 5 years, and well, the world has changed in the last 2 years. So anyways, this is kind of the reasoning for putting it at 5 years, and that aligns as well with Walden's policies of going back to the literature 5 years. So the search strategy is quite detailed, so we won't go into it here, but of course it's recorded so that if anybody chose to, they could reproduce the search. Next is setting up a method for reviewing articles and coding, and of course tracking and record keeping system to record decisions along each step. Then creating a database to record and calculate the effect sizes and study characteristics. I'm using Excel right now to do that. And then of course the last step is to conduct meta-analysis. So to go into a little more detail on each step, there's lots and lots of tools out there to choose from. So we'll start to conduct the quantitative review. I'm looking at Cochrane reviews. So I don't know if you all are familiar with them. It's a nonprofit organization. They do clinical reviews. They have a library this is all accessible to the public. So they've got a library that is phenomenal of clinical reviews. Lots and lots of information about COVID. So if you're interested in anything, the reviews of clinical studies to date, they have that. But they also have a lot of resources for people who are conducting their own quantitative review, systematic review, and meta-analysis. So they basically give a step-by-step guide, starting with developing your research question to make sure that it aligns with your search strategy, and vice versa, how to design your inclusion criteria and that sort of thing. So I'm relying heavily on kind of templates that they have to offer to keep things organized. And then to review and code the article, I've started using a software called Rayon. It's really easy. Very intuitive to use. You can very easily import an entire search from our library. You import it right into the software, which is nice. And it'll pull up, it organizes things and categorizes things. So you know the types of articles, the publications, the date of publication, how many you have. It dedupes, so you don't have duplicate articles. And then you can pull up, as you go through your review, you can pull up each article, either look at the entire article if you'd like to, or it can defaults to title, keywords, and abstract. There's a function to put in keywords. So for instance, for my purposes, I have things like well-being, autonomy, maybe the different scales used for those, and it'll highlight those throughout the text. So there's functions to choose the article, to reject it, and give reasons why, which is really important for transparency. So you can explain why you chose to reject this particular article, and it's all right there to be saved. Not really relevant for my purposes, but there's a great way to collaborate with others where you can all review and the same articles but not see what the other person has decided on it until later. So anyways, that's Rayon. And then after Rayon is extracting, or after the review, extracting the statistics from the included articles to export into Excel and then eventually into R. So this is the fuzzy step. I'm not sure. I know there's ways to do it. I've found a few different ways in the last few days, but I'm not exactly sure how to do it other than hand coding, which will not work. So basically, you've got to get all of those effect sizes and any other statistics from the articles to Excel. And then what to extract. So again, from the most original form of self-determination theory, outcome variables are well-being and performance. But what do those really look like in other primary studies? So I think the most important thing for this, again, is to document all of the decisions. So, and actually, Dr. Thompson, my chair, had some really good advice. So at this point, I'm just extracting as much information as possible, as many statistics as possible for as many variables, especially the outcome variables as possible, and putting them on the spreadsheet. And then ideally, I'll be able to categorize the relevant ones for this study, explain why, but have that data all set and ready for the next adventure on the next meta-analysis. And then lastly, I'll be using R for analysis. There's a metaphor package that's designed specifically for meta-analysis. If anybody's tried to self-teach themselves R, do you know kind of where I'm at? It's a really, really slow process. Let's see, participants, back to the slide. Basically, I'm gathering information from prior research, so working with participants isn't an issue. And then data analysis. So the reason why I originally chose to do a meta-analysis was because I love research methodology. I love statistics. I don't have much experience at either, and I'm not really good at it. So I figured this would be a really good way to kind of stretch and challenge myself, and it's proving to be so. But with that being said, I'm still learning an awful lot about this data analysis. So we'll go over pretty briefly, probably check back in 6 months when I should have this thing completed, and I'll have a better presentation for that. But basically, the idea of meta-analysis is that by using statistics from primary studies, we can explore how the sample and study descriptors differ across all of the studies as sources of differences in effect sizes. So, of course, as a null hypothesis, statistical testing is used. You set up your null hypothesis p-value of 0.05% in this case. And then the effect sizes. So effect sizes tells us the strength and direction of a relationship. So for instance, it would be a relationship between autonomy, supportive workplace, and employee well-being. So by standardizing and averaging the effect sizes across each study, it helps us to kind of look at a bigger picture of what's going on, at the strengths and directions of relationships across all studies. So in a perfect world, the effect sizes would be published in these primary studies. I can tell you they aren't. So practice in statistics, hopefully there's enough information to be able to pull from there to be able to calculate the effect sizes myself. Then after all of these effect sizes from every included studies have been gathered, is calculating an average effect size, and that's the standardized mean difference. Again, by standardizing that, we can kind of look at all the relationships across the board. So again, my idea is to investigate national differences for sources of variability this way. So bias corrected hedges G is the formula I'm using to calculate and standardize mean differences. The reason being for this, it seems it's the best formula to use for standardizing studies with different sample sizes. And then lastly, of course, throughout every step is to investigate for potential bias, and that's from each included study through all of my processes, publication bias, any of the biases that might be going along the way. And then lastly, social change implications. So regardless of the findings, the study will contribute to social changes, and that's by testing a model that might be useful for testing all job attitude theories cross-nationally. So it'll also contribute to ongoing research about self-determination theory and in effect in other job attitude theories that we regularly use to help support workers and to enhance our workplaces. So I think we've got references on the next slide, please. And then aside from that, thank you for being here, and I hope you have some questions for me.
Perfect. Thank you for that great presentation, Michele.
Thank you.
We do have time for questions, and since we have a small group, if you'd like to unmute yourself and share your question or just type it into the chat. I do have a question for you, Michele, to start with.
Yes.
Could you talk about different challenges that you experienced during the research process, and how have you addressed those challenges so far?
Oh, you bet. Yeah, there's lots of challenges. That's an easy one to talk about. Mostly I'm having a personal challenge with keeping focused. So if you can imagine, 134 articles and reviewing each article, there's a lot of really interesting information out there that might not be relevant, but I find myself getting sidetracked and kind of, reading this article and going on beyond. It has nothing to do with my study. So that's been one challenge. And then the second one is really trying to figure out the variables that make sense, and that can be, between one article and the next, how to pull them all together. They may have different names, they're measured differently. And I think that's sort of just inherently a challenge with doing a systemic review and meta-analysis. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We can wait just a few more seconds to see if there are any additional questions. Otherwise, Michele, if you have any final remarks before we close out, you're free to give them now as well.
Oh, thank you. I just appreciate the opportunity to get my work out there a little bit and to practice presenting. I haven't done an awful lot of presenting, and this was a really, really good supportive way to be able to do it. So thank you. Thank you.